I think we'll get going now. So sorry for the slightly delayed start. Welcome to the Nuffield Foundation. Welcome to everyone in the room here, and welcome to everyone online as well. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's launch of this really important piece of research looking at the early years workforce in the UK. I'm Eleanor. I'm a programme head here at the Nuffield Foundation, and I look after our early years work. And it was a real honour to be able to fund this work and to host the launch today. For people online, my colleagues Ellen and Bianca will be looking after you. If you've got any kind of technical issues, please do drop them a note in the chat box. And if you've got anything that's going on at all, we will be having a question and answer session later on today, and you can use the Q&A function on Teams for that. Before we get going, there's a few housekeeping things for everyone in the room just to let you know about. So the toilets are out there. Hopefully most of you have found them by now, but if not, they're either side of the lifts. Each floor is accessible by 2 lifts and 2 staircases. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off today, so if it does, I'll be donning my high vis because I'm a fire marshal, and you can follow me all out of the building, down the staircase because we can't use the lifts, and the fire assembly point is 78 to 80 St John's Street, which is just down the road. And if you require any assistance to leave the building, please let me or another member of Nuffield Foundation staff know. We are going to be recording today's event. The camera will be facing, so it won't be able to see members of the audience. And Sasha's also going to be taking a couple of pictures. Again, it'll be of the presenters, not of the audience. I think that's everything. Just to let you know that we also are very lucky to have Kyle from TES here over just at the back there. Hi, Kyle. So thank you very much for coming as well. So back to the reason that we are here today. We've been funding work about early years for a number of years at the Nuffield Foundation. And one of the reasons we were so keen to fund this particular project was not only because of the incredible team who are from all across the UK, but also because this project not only sets out the issues in early years workforce that are really familiar to us, but have identified policies that have actually had an impact and been effective, and learned from evidence from across the UK and internationally about how to address some of these really entrenched issues. I won't say any more because the research team will be telling you all about it in one moment. But I do just want to let you know that it's part of a suite of different work we're funding about the early years workforce at the moment. We're also funding Mona Saka, Sarah Bonetti, who's over there, hi Sarah, and Kayla Halls to look at a study of quality in early years education and childcare for 0 to 2-year-olds. And we are funding researchers from UCL and NAPSEN Social Research to carry out a large study about childminders to try and understand why their numbers are falling so much and to help work out how to improve their working conditions. And we're hoping that the evidence from these projects and the findings from this study presented today will make a substantial contribution to help us understand what needs to be done to better support the early years workforce. And you can find out more about any of them by coming and talking to me over lunch, which will be served outside at 1 p.m. and on our website as well. Okay, without any further ado, I will hand over to Beatrice, who's the Chief Executive of Early Education. Welcome, Beatrice.
Thank you. So I'm going to be very brief because what you really want to do today is hear from the researchers. But for those who don't know early education, we are, I think, the only early years organisation in the UK that spans all 4 nations. And that's why things like this project are so important, that actually a lot of the time our members might be meeting just in England or just in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland, and particularly since COVID, we've not had as many events where we've got everybody in a room, but often it is those conversations across borders that come up with really interesting new knowledge. So we were really pleased to have this project. I want to say a huge thank you, firstly to Kathy Nutt-Brown, who started the project off as our principal investigator. Kathy then in the summer had to hand that on And a huge thanks to Verity, who stepped in and who, having thought that she was only going to have to be responsible for England in this project, then had to take on the overall coordination. But to all of our team, most of whom are in the room, so to Ailey, Mandy and Glenda, we have two Glendas, Glenda Walsh and Glenda Tinney, to our research assistants. We've got Catherine and Sasha and Kirsty in the room, and I think Gillian is with us online. Thanks also to Natasha, to Suzanne in Northern Ireland, who I think may be online, and also to our other two Scottish co-investigators, who again I hope are online. That's Lynn and, sorry, but by this stage my brain falls out, it runs out of names, but I do know Marion. Thank you, Lynn and Marion. So it's been a big team, and actually we haven't all been together in a room. This is the closest we've got. But I hope that you'll see from this that we've really begun to scratch the surface of the ways in which we can learn from one another. And we are very grateful, of course, to the Nuffield Foundation for funding the project, and we look forward to hearing everybody's views, questions. Please do store up questions for the Q&A. And I think that's probably all that I need to say. So at this point, I'm hoping we can pass across to Kathy, Professor Dame Kathy Nott-Brown, who is Early Education's president, and who will give us a bit of an introduction to the background of the project. So hopefully Kathy will pop up. This is if the technology works. Hopefully we can get the sort of unmuting and the camera to work. Kathy would have loved to have been here in person, but wasn't able to. But yeah, we're really glad that she, hopefully, there we go. She's joining us. So, Kathy.
Hi, thanks Beatrice, and hello everybody. I'm so sorry not to be there today, not least because the wonderful team that brought this project together is mostly in the room, but I'm really glad to be able to join you remotely as we launch our report. Our work began in the context of many initiatives to address the difficulties that pervade early years provision, not least the qualifications and status of those who work within the early years. And there's broad agreement of the need for change in early years professions, and a broad understanding that qualifications, remuneration and retention are still inadequate on the whole. And despite several reviews for several governments over recent years, too few positive changes have occurred. And it's not an underestimate to say that a crisis has developed, and early years provision remains in crisis because too few are choosing to work with young children, and many who begin working with young children often leave because their conditions of service and necessary support are inadequate. Now, everybody here this morning is only too aware of the arguments, so I don't need to rehearse those again. Early Education, with the support of Nuffield Foundation funding, decided to consider the strengths and challenges across all 4 nations of the UK. As a UK-wide organisation, Early Education brought together 4 teams from England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales to consider what has worked in terms of policies in each UK nation, with the aim of learning from each nation and making positive policy recommendations that might take things forward. We want to put forward suggestions for making a difference and to lift early years provision out of the crises that have pervaded us for too many years. We want to move on from the broadly agreed need for change to concrete recommendations that help governments to create and enact policies that bring about real change for the whole of the UK, for all children and their educators. Now, the situation of people, mostly women, working in jobs seen as low status, undervalued, inadequate conditions of service, including pay, has gone on for far too long. If we undervalue those who work in the early years, we undervalue our young children. We can tell so much about a country by looking at how its children are valued, and that includes the quality of their care and education. There remain too many instances of children being last in the queue when it comes to public investment. In the last decade, generations of children have been sold short, because while successive governments have acknowledged a need for change, and some policy changes have led to more funding, and there is still more to do. In terms of qualifications, status, remuneration and retention in the early years professions, we still have entrenched difficulties, and of course that impacts on the recruitment of future generations for the workforce and on young children's experiences. Policies to help parents pay for early years places for their children are only as good as the ability of providers to attract high quality staff who understand about the pedagogy of play, about child development, about the importance of shared stories and the delight in discovery. I'll go further than arguing that this is a crisis. We are experiencing another form of national debt. The UK continues to run up a national debt which is being paid by its children, and we cannot continue in this state. It's time to pay the debt in full. Sound investment in a properly and fully funded, multi-qualified early years profession made up of people in a range of roles with defined responsibilities is now crucial. This is possible. Children have paid the price for too long. They can't wait any longer. If national initiatives are to yield positive quality experiences for young children, the debt owed over generations must be paid. This is possible. I was privileged to lead the early education team for phase 1 of our project, and now I'm delighted to pass over to Professor Verity Campbell-Barr, who's led the team in the second phase, to introduce the findings of our report. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and lovely to see you from all the project team. A big hello to you. Welcome everybody. It's lovely to see so many people here in person, but also our colleagues that we've got online. We've heard a bit about this from Kathy already in terms of what the project was looking at, but it was focused on those workforce challenges that Kathy was speaking about there. But actually it was also trying to pick up on the positives. What are the interventions that have happened previously across the 4 nations that have had an impact and that have helped in terms of that set of conditions for children that Kathy was referring to? And also to draw on the international evidence. What is it that we can learn from our international colleagues around good policy implementation when it comes to issues of workforce? So really trying to focus on the actions that would drive that positive change and how we could best embed this in terms of making early years workforce policy making. The project design started with a review of national and international scholarship, particularly looking at the grey literature from the last 15 years. And we also did interviews with stakeholders in each of the nations to find out what were those things that had been working in the different parts of the UK. In addition to that, we did 10 interviews with international experts to explore good examples that we've seen elsewhere in the world around that early years workforce policy implementation. And then based on those findings, we had focus groups with experts across the nations to find out their perspectives, asking really targeted questions as what might policy actually look like in this space. I think the project is quite unique in having such a large panel of people involved. So we had over 80 experts that we spoke to. In addition to that, we had an amazing advisory group, and thank you very much to them for the input that they have given through this project. Importantly, as I start to go through the findings, each of the nations is in a different place in terms of their early years workforce policy. And later on, my colleagues will come up so we can start to draw out some of those nuances. So that's our starting point, that we are at different starting points. But I think the other thing that we would say as a project team is that this is a highly skilled profession committed to high quality early years education and care. And across the data, we've got wonderful examples of the commitment of those people working in the workforce. So we really want to value everything that they do. But there are the challenges. So these were highlighted in our interim report. I don't think they will come as any surprise to most people in this room, but the issues of recruitment and retention are being felt across the sector. That we've got a fragmented qualification system, which is being exacerbated by differences between the different sectors, poor career progression for people, low professional status that we heard Kathy talk about before, the issues of pay and professional recognition. That there's a failure to resolve that relationship between associated professions, that we still have teaching in one camp and those in the early years workforce in another. We have got to break down that barrier between the two. We also have the challenge of the underrepresentation of men and ethnic minorities in the workforce, and our workforce needs to reflect the communities in which they are working. That needs addressing, as I'll come on to discuss as well. And ultimately, yes, government funding needs to be targeted at the right areas if this is going to be effective. But having set out those challenges, we did see positive things. So here is just a list of some of the things that people were pulling out in terms of things that they thought had worked well in that policy context. So in England, the Graduate Leadership Fund was credited as being a very successful policy, but not just because of the funding, but because of the local support structures that were put in place so that graduates could come together and network. In Scotland, initiatives to encourage practitioners to upgrade their qualifications have been important, and in many ways, Scotland are leading the way for a graduate-led workforce. The early years specialist role in Northern Ireland was about bringing together the different sectors and was really powerful in terms of the professional development side of things. The collaborative approaches taking place in Wales was bridging those gaps between education and care. And you can see also in terms of the Racist Wales Action Plan that they've got there as well. So there are examples across the UK of where policy and done well, people recognise that and they want to celebrate that and can feel the benefits from it. The international interviews, yes, again, there were the challenges, and these are really similar to what was being found in the UK, the issues of recruitment and retention, that relationship to the teaching profession that needs to be addressed, issues around professional status, fluctuating policy commitments and initiatives, and again, the issue of funding. But again, there were lots of positive examples. So in the Republic of Ireland, people talked about the strength of the way in which they consulted with the sector. It felt like policy that was being made together rather than policy that was being done to them. It was also about nations that have got a strong vision and commitment in terms of their policy. And often within those international examples, it came to what Kathy was saying about this is about a vision for children and childhood. It's not just about the early years workforce. And in terms of having that vision, there was recognition for the needs that at times you need local adaptation. Now, obviously, when you're looking at international examples, we know there are different structures in place. And obviously with the German federal system, it kind of lends itself to that local adaptation. But in Estonia, they talked about how local authorities, their equivalent of local authorities, working together with further education and higher education to provide CPD that was specific to the localised context. And that actually those localised responses give the opportunity to nuance what it is that the workforce need in different areas of a country. Whilst we were doing this project, there were many times where I thought, I'm just going to get up and move. And one of them was to move to Canada, where they are committed to having mentoring in place for newly qualified people. But actually what it was showing is that it was impacting on the retention of the workforce, that bringing people together in groups to share good professional practice was making a difference. But there were notes of caution. In Iceland, they talked about be careful that having that local flexibility does not come with lowering expectations. There needs to be a baseline that we are all achieving, but at the same time, you do need some adaptability. And that actually, yes, internationally, everyone is feeling this recruitment challenge, but that doesn't mean we proliferate the routes to training and open up more, that actually we still need qualifications that will give people the knowledge and skills needed to work with young children. And at the core of that is strong pedagogical knowledge. I think it was in New Zealand where they talked about do not let qualifications be a race to the bottom. And actually somebody who had a wealth of international expertise said, why do we focus at the entry level? We need to be aiming high and we need to think about that graduate-led. And again, this thing that we've got to be working with associate professions and teaching obviously came up again. And the example from Canada that they were talking about, we need to recognise that ultimately we are recruiting from the same pool of people. These are people interested in working with young children to support their care and education. Training providers are trying to recruit from the same pools. So why aren't we working together more closely to try and eliminate those barriers that we see between the different professions? It was evident across the international interviews that people were really passionate about saying the early years workforce is a profession and titles matter. So what we call people is really important. And the other thing that came through, degree-led matters as well. And actually people were willing to say to us in terms of the position of the UK, and there are nuances in the different nations, is we're starting to lag behind. Other nations who at one point didn't have a commitment to degree-led now do, and we need to think about that. And it's important, and this came through again in the international interviews, this isn't about any degree. This is about a degree that has the relevant knowledge and skills needed to work with child development and to support child development. And I'll talk more about that later. Ultimately, people flagged what Kathy was saying to us, that this is a profession that provides the foundations to children's lifelong learning. It's a profession that contributes to several cross-cutting policy areas, and that we need departments to work together. But actually, we also need those departments to address the gap in the rhetoric between saying early years is important and the level of funding that we see to support those early years, that gap needs to be closed. So in the focus groups where we spoke to our experts across the 4 nations, and we asked them specific questions, perhaps unsurprisingly, yes, we need minimum qualifications for all professionals. And people were really keen to stress this is those working with babies as well as those working with young children and toddlers. Yes, all educators do need a core of skills and knowledge in order to perform their professional role. Yes, there should be a system of professional recognition. Yes, there should be enhanced remuneration. Yes, there is a need for consistent terminology. Now, whilst it might not be surprising to see people saying yes to all of these things, as they say, the devil is in the detail as to what this might actually look like. So in terms of those entry requirements, there needs to be minimum qualification requirements. These are absolutely essential to the quality of early years provision that we're providing our youngest children. We've got to move away from unqualified staff being working in these settings. And that there is recognition that this isn't about everyone having to be a graduate, it's about the proportions of people with different levels of qualification working with those youngest children. But in terms of those qualifications, there needs to be really clear routes. People need to know which qualification it is that's going to provide them with the career that they want in the future. And actually, what people were saying is that young people are doing qualifications and then getting to the end of it and discovering it's not actually going to enable them to have the career that they want. That's doing a disservice to those young people, let alone the fact that we've got a proliferation of qualification rates across the country that actually just makes it really confusing to know what to do if you want a career in this sector. So ultimately, it comes down to the quality of the implementation of those qualifications. Often people were saying that when you look at them on paper, there's a lot of good within those qualifications. The difficulty comes that you've got so many different providers delivering them. There's no quality assurance of what that delivery might be. And I think of some of the interviews I did in the early stages, and people telling me, I employ a level 3 and I just don't know what's going to walk through the door. And that should not be the case. People should have confidence in the qualifications that they're undertaking and then employing people with those qualifications. It was also flagged that working with young children is hard work. And that actually we need to think about introductory courses. The suggestion that someone should have worked with children maybe during their school work experience prior to taking up that apprenticeship, so we don't end up in a situation where 2 weeks into an apprenticeship they go, this is too hard for me, I'm going to step away. So in terms of those entry requirements, focusing on introductory courses, and yes, we do need a demonstration around English and mathematics. What I will say here is that we talked about GCSEs as being a measure of that English and mathematics. There's another project to be done about the quality of GCSEs at the moment because people weren't convinced that that was the right way in which to go about assessing English and mathematics. In terms of those qualifications, people talked about the professional knowledge and skills that are needed to work with young children, and obviously that core knowledge on child development being absolutely central, and we see that in the international evidence. The importance of knowing about play-based pedagogy, the importance of safeguarding, attachment, additional needs, supporting families, teamwork, the list could go on. But importantly, people talked about it's not just knowledge and skills, it's also about the values of those people working within early childhood education and care services. And people want to recognise that there is a relational and emotional aspect to working with young children that is really important, and we shouldn't hide away from it in developing quality qualifications. The other thing is that people in our focus groups, they did talk about the importance of experience. Experience is valued. The difficulty is you don't know the quality of that experience. So if it has been experienced for 10 years in a nursery that perhaps sadly isn't of quality that we would like, then that could be perpetuating poor quality practice going forwards. So what qualifications do is enable us to make sure people have got the prerequisite knowledge and skills and values to work with young children, but obviously experience helps develop those as well. Progression came up as an issue, and that we need to have clear progression routes that clearly demonstrate how there's an advancement in knowledge and skills. We do need to have induction periods as well, so people are supported in those early stages of their careers. And I will say it again, we have got to address the relationship to teaching and the issue around QTS coming up and who can have it and who can't have it. That needs to be sorted out, that needs to just go. And that ultimately this progression route can link to registration, that you can then show someone's progression and have that link to their registration. But there were questions around who will be paying for the registration systems as we go forwards. And ultimately people talked about we need to commit to graduate leadership. And again, we're at different stages in the different nations around this. But importantly, that this isn't just any degree, it is a degree that covers learning and the development of young children from birth to 8. And that isn't just about those degrees that come with QTS. There are other degrees that we have available for young people that also provide them with that relevant knowledge and skills to work with young children. Importantly, people talked about the issue of recognition and that we do need to recognise that this is a profession, that we've got to stop that gap between the rhetoric of the importance of the early years and the professional status. People talking about them being seen as the lower class citizens. That's just not appropriate at all for these people working with our young children. We do need to think about remuneration and the conditions of service. People were talking about registration is welcomed, but it's not the priority. And I'll go on to talk about how we need to have quality qualifications before you can talk about registration. But ultimately, that registration also needs to think about how it's going to relate to issues around pay and conditions. And in terms of funding, the idea that someone can be delivering the same curriculum stage and be getting different levels of funding depending on which sector they're in, that needs to be addressed, as does the issue around the pay and conditions that they get depending on which sector they're in. That also needs to be addressed. People talked about workforce voice and representation and identity, that we do need to agree consistent terminology for how we're going to talk about these professionals. You know, some people were talking in the focus group that it's derogatory really to say that this is a level 3. It doesn't mean anything and it doesn't uphold professional status. But we need to consult with the sector. And if you look at the details in the report, people were talking about, do we talk about educare? Do we talk about educators? Do we talk about pedagogues? That debate is still going on in terms of what the terminology should be. But let's ask the people that knows the best. Those are the people that are working with young children. And that those issues around diversity and inclusion of the workforce, we've got to find a way to address those so that the workforce represents the communities that they're working in. So, as I said, although the project was looking at raising policy issues, it was also about identifying the things that work to support good policy implementation. So being cohesive, making sure that, you know, one policy isn't going to negatively have an impact elsewhere. So having that cohesion with positive, clear direction. And across the nations, you know, it's welcomed that we are seeing things come out at the moment, such as Best Start in Life in England and the Welsh Government's 10-year workforce plan. These are welcomed and these are opportunities for us to get policy right going forwards. Across the data, people were talking about the importance of consultation, working with the sector, not doing it to them. And there were examples of where this has already gone well, so realising the ambition being one possible example to look at, and also the way in which curriculum developments took place in Wales were seen as processes that really worked with the sector. Communication is obviously important, and people saying we don't need to do everything at once. Actually, that can be overwhelming in itself. So let's think about what we want to do in which order in order to get things right. And that's focused on collaboration, the idea of bringing people together. That's not just about bringing together different government departments. It's not just about bringing the sector together, but it's actually giving opportunities for the professionals themselves to have those moments together, such as was identified in the Graduate Leadership Fund and such as was seen in the earlier specialist in Northern Ireland. But in terms of having that cohesion and that positive direction, we need to recognise that across the UK, we have very different communities and there will need to be some local adaptability, and recognising the role that local authorities can play in making sure that they're able to respond to local challenges that they may be facing. So in terms of our recommendations, we do believe that we need to move towards graduate-led, and we have stated in the report that we think this should be 50% for England, Northern Ireland and Wales, but we believe that Scotland has the opportunity to be aspirational here and go for 100%. And we've based that on data that we have around the number of graduates in the profession so far. There needs to be a clear qualification framework. Someone can know where their career is going to take them when they're working with young children. But in terms of that qualification framework, it also needs to be about a consistent level of quality in the delivery of those qualifications. We've got to stop the proliferation. Somebody needs to know, I do this course in order to get this role, and this is where my progression will then take me. So we have to have quality assurance mechanisms for qualifications in terms of looking at that implementation. And we do need to make sure that those qualifications have got the appropriate knowledge and skills embedded within them, so that someone employing someone can be confident that they're going to come ready to work with young children. With that in mind, where we have unqualified staff being able to be employed within the early years sector, we need to move away from that. We should not have unqualified people working with our youngest children in society. And where it's not already the case, we need to make sure that we introduce a minimum qualification requirement. And looking at the example of Wales, the idea of having a working towards status, recognising that there will be a transition phase in terms of us reaching that graduate-led workforce. People do need to have satisfactory English and numeracy and Welsh in the Welsh context as well, and that people should have that work experience so that they can demonstrate that they've spent at least 30 hours with children to know that this is the profession that they want to go into. And that once in employment, as I say, making sure that we move away from that unqualified, having an ambition that level 3, and that's within the English, Welsh and Northern Irish context, that is the minimum threshold. The issues of pay need to be looked at, and I think this is beyond the scope of this project, but there needs to be in each nation a working group set up to look at national pay scales, and that needs to look at working alongside the teaching professions and the reviews taking place at the moment around teaching assistants. We also need to make sure that there is mentoring for all staff, and actually what we found through the project, this doesn't necessarily have to be one-to-one mentoring. The value of meetings where people can come together in those localities is just as important for supporting retention of the workforce. There needs to be a newly qualified status for graduates in the same way that we see newly qualified status for teachers. We need to have a probationary period for all of those newly qualified people. And that across the early years workforce, there should be a commitment to a minimum of 3 days in-service training for all providers so that they have inset days in the same way that we see in later stages of education. And for that registration, for it to be a single registration system and not risking ending up with duality as we see in Scotland. And that registration system, there's a real opportunity there to make sure that we get the titles right, that we have consistent job titles that are relevant to different roles. And we need to look at the issues around diversity in the workforce and use that registration system as a way to be monitoring that diversity and ensure that there's equitability of opportunity for all of those people choosing to work in early years and childcare. As I said, a working group in each nation to look at those pay scales to be set up, and then moving on and talking about the professional progression and registration. But as I said, for us as a project team, one of the things that we thought around each of these areas is that you've got to address this bottom layer first before you can move up and address the other layers. So you've got to look at the quality of qualifications to be able to set those pay scales, to be able to determine that professional progression framework, and then have that linked to a registration system. So I'm now going to invite my colleagues to come and talk about their respective nations to give you some of that nuance that we saw across the different countries. And I just want to give credit to our artist, a young 4-year-old in Northern Ireland, who did this picture for us. So colleagues. So I've realised you're now going to have your backs to your slides. So I will stay here to go through the slides as we do. But first up is Northern Ireland, Glenda.
Hello everyone, I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I would like to extend a special welcome to all of my Northern Ireland and Irish colleagues who are online today as well. So just to kick off, I would like to say it has been a real privilege to have been involved in this project and work with such a wonderful team in many respects. And I would also like to say a thank you to Kirsty likewise, who has really guided and supported me throughout where the Northern Ireland data has been concerned. So where Northern Ireland is concerned, there's been so many learnings with this project, with regard to this project. And there's sort of three key reflections that I would like to bring to your attention today. The first one being sort of the overall timeliness of the project for Northern Ireland really matters. So Northern Ireland at present, it stands at a pivotal policy moment with a new early learning and childcare strategy, which includes a dedicated section on workforce due for publication. So the findings of this study offer Northern Ireland timely learning about what to do and also what not to do, drawing from the successes and challenges of the other UK nations. So this evidence provides a rare opportunity for Northern Ireland to build that coherent, future-proof workforce strategy that we really do need, grounded in international insights and also the voices of the stakeholders themselves and tailored to Northern Ireland's unique context. Secondly then, the stakeholders themselves spoke about this professional confidence for a beautifully diverse Northern Ireland. So they emphasise the need for early years educators to feel confident and competent in supporting children from an increasingly diverse range of ethnic, linguistic and cultural backgrounds, moving beyond what we have known in Northern Ireland for many years, that Protestant-Catholic divide. And they argue that this requires continuous professional development, stronger qualification routes, and a shared understanding of inclusive practice across all sectors. So any workforce strategy in Northern Ireland must ensure that educators are equipped to nurture every child in Northern Ireland's beautiful diversity. And this is particularly encouraging for Northern Ireland listeners. And then our third point then, like the rest of the other nations, the stakeholders spoke of the need to address the long-standing Cinderella issue, where early years tends to be the poor partner in that respect, and that the early years workforce is truly valued and truly respected. And Northern Ireland stakeholders, right from baby rooms, those who work with babies, right through to early years teachers themselves, spoke of poor pay, limited progression, low status, inconsistent qualification expectations across statutory, private and voluntary sectors. And the study highlights the need, and you've heard it from Verity today, the need for that clear qualification framework, meaningful parity across sectors, and remuneration that recognises the complexity of the early years workforce. And that is so relevant to Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, we can't continue to rely on a workforce where up to 50% have no relevant qualification while educating and caring for our youngest children. A graduate-led, properly rewarded workforce is essential for quality, for stability and for retention. And surely our youngest children in Northern Ireland deserve such quality too. So I would just like to finish by extending a heartfelt thanks to all of the participants, both in Northern Ireland and Ireland, who generously contributed their time, many in conversations which lasted almost 2 hours in length. Their dedication and their honesty underscore both the challenges but also the hope that underpin this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenda. And then we move over to our Glenda in Wales.
All these Glendas.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have to say, this has been such a wonderful opportunity to work with colleagues across the sector and across the nations. An opportunity that we really valued, myself and Natasha, who's also in the crowd. And I think a lot of what's already been said is reflected in the people we spoke to in Wales. The big thing that's come out from talking to the stakeholders is valuing the profession. And we heard numerous stories of people who are enthusiastic, motivated, still leaving into completely different sectors because of remuneration, pay and all those things, and not being valued and seen as important. And one person was talking to me about, if all the research is telling us 0 to 5, 0 to 5 is so essential, why aren't we reflecting that in the people who work with 0 to 5s? So that valuing of the profession in different ways was seen as really important. And I think one of the positive things that came out was this idea, well, one of the ways to do that has been happening in Wales is co-construction and collaboration in terms of policy context. So people talking about having ownership of policy, and early years practitioners, professionals, who are experts in the field, having a voice in the curriculum, for example, and in other provision within the early years context. And that came out as really, really positive, that people wanted to have their say in the policy context in Wales. And that, as I'll tell you a little bit later, is happening. The other thing that's come out, I think, in all of the countries and very much in Wales is bridging the sectors. You mentioned educare. That came out, I think, for most of our stakeholders. Why is there this gap? If you're in a school working with young children, and if you're in the non-maintained sector working with young children, the qualifications are different, the requirements are different, the pay is different, the working conditions are different. We couldn't understand, and they couldn't understand, this divide, and thinking about ways of trying to make that less. We know in Wales there are some moves happening, and people talked very positively of the curriculum for funded non-maintained settings, where we're now seeing schools and non-maintained settings adopting this curriculum and using that specialist knowledge that's come from the sector in all of those early years sectors. We've also got the early childhood play, learning and care planning in Wales. Again, seen as a move to bridging the gap between education on one side and maybe traditionally seen as care on the other, that it's bringing that together. And that was seen as very positive by stakeholders, but maybe needs to be shared more widely. So one of the things that came out in terms of policy was, we've got these wonderful ideas, but how are we implementing it, or how are we sharing those ideas beyond maybe the civil servants or whatever? And I suppose in Wales, the other thing that we've got, we talked a lot about diversity in the workforce. This is a challenge that we have in terms of gender, in terms of cultural diversity and so on. We also have the other thing in Wales of bilingualism in terms of Welsh and English language use. Under the law, there's an equality of status for both languages, but that has its own challenges, which we talked about in the research, in terms of upskilling staff who may not have confidence in their Welsh medium skills. Also, other people who may need to gain more skills in the language, and how we do that without alienating people. And also some wonderful projects that are ongoing to help us do that, from organisations in Wales such as Camwrth Gam to Bridge, where we want a confident bilingual workforce. And I think some of that, I hadn't realised till I did this project, helped me see how we can offer between us, help each other in the 4 nations around diversity, language use and so on in settings. So I think those are the key things that really reflect the UK as a whole. And I just want to say a big thank you. It's been such a privilege to work with these wonderful people here. We've had such a great opportunity at the University of Wales, St David, and also to all the people who took part in the research as well. You know, we always say the early years workforce is so important and they should be valued as such. Thank you.
Wendy.
Thank you so much, Verity, and all of our team for the opportunity to share today. It's worth getting up for the red-eye flight to be down here in time. And to thank colleagues back home in Scotland who couldn't come today. I have one colleague here, not in the team as it happens, but a great supporter. And particularly I'd like to thank Marion Lynn and Gillian, our research assistant, who's much more than a research assistant and has my back, which I think is what you were saying as well, Glenda. So thank you to our research assistants. Scotland is probably a different case. I think we've had a plethora of policy for the last 25 years, and we have some policy exhaustion. We also understand that any policy is only as good as the people who try and implement it. And if they're exhausted, if they're feeling devalued, then we're not going to get very far. So I think our call is for a renewing of Scottish policy around early childhood. We have all the bits there, and we need to take stock of where we've got to. We're awaiting an interesting conversation with a colleague from LSE just now over evaluation of our huge expansion in Scotland and how that probably has left people very exhausted as well. So I want to pay credit to our government that has kept its focus on early years for a long time. They've been busy carving out a separate sector for the early years called early learning and childcare. And we used to value the continuity that we had with primary education. So some of the same issues, of course, that we all have, that Verity was highlighting. At a time when we were expanding early learning and childcare, we also had a new inspection framework. We have 2 inspection organisations, we have 2 registration organisations, and you sometimes want to bang their heads together so that they could come out of their silos and work together in really constructive ways, because ultimately this is about children. And although we didn't ask children their views this time around, nor practitioners, except if we were interviewing them, they're at the core of what we're trying to do. So we have policy achievements, we have strong pedagogical guidelines that are wonderful, and I recommend realising the ambition that came from ground up. And one of our team is a co-author of that, that guidance. But it's guidance. And I think this is a strength in Scotland that we've talked always about guidance, curriculum guidance. It is not there by law. However, I think we're small enough for people to collude with policy rather than to be critical of it. And that is an issue, I think, in early childhood that should change as people become more confident in their professional roles. So we have similarly this proliferation of different qualification routes, the content, the experience, the outcomes, lots of CPD opportunities if you can find the time to attend them. And boy, do early years people turn out. Yeah. On and on. I think they're so brave in that they do that. We have real concerns, and we need benchmarks about those ratios, those proportions between qualified staff and those who are not. But we do have a registration structure with 3 levels in it and a pathway. And as Verity said, we're just about at 100%. We have that ambition for every early childhood setting that is funded by government, indirectly through local authorities. We have that ambition for a graduate leader in every single one of those settings. But is that person backed up by other qualified staff? And is the time to mentor? We have a national induction programme. It sits there. We have lots of policy that sits there, and it's hard for people to digest it and to use it. So we need to look at each setting to understand, is the one graduate and nobody else, and at huge turnover and repeated induction and exhaustion from doing that, or is the one graduate leader and other people working towards their qualifications, currently on degree courses, about to have their full registration? And I think the qualifications and registration actually have to sit together. I like your hierarchy for the project as a whole, but I think we're finding in Scotland that the reward of your qualification is being registered at a commensurate level. But then we have the trouble of 2 bodies, one for teachers and one for educators. So that needs attention. And then, like you've described, the whole question of pay parity, this is a national issue for us across the United Kingdom. But we have a strong sense in Scotland that if we could get that right, then people would value themselves more, They would be able to focus more on the kind of pedagogies that they want to have, on their leadership, on their work with families, and to make a difference for young children. And so that ultimately, as with the other nations, has to be our aim. So I'm very happy when it comes to a broader discussion to elaborate on any of that and the differences and similarities. But those threads there about getting it right for children, which is a policy we have, but what happens if you don't? If you can't do that? It's very hard for professionals in the early years sector to think they might fail children. And with the huge pressures upon them, that is a possibility at the moment, when we're not retaining people for long enough for them really to be embedded in the kind of pedagogies we want. So lots of hope, but lots of realism. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks to our friends online, and it was lovely to see Kathy again.
So lastly, just a few reflections from the English context, because that was the part I was originally leading on the project. And as other people have said, thank you to our research assistants. I've got Catherine and Sasha here with me. They're monitoring the chat online, so if people have got questions, they will make sure they get fed into the room. So do ask questions online as well as in the room. I think from the English perspective, it felt really timely to be working on this project now with the publication of Best Start in Life, just as we were trying to finalise the interim report. So a few hasty edits happened in the background for that one. But it feels like we're all kind of on the same page and thinking we need to be doing something in this space. And what we really hope is that some of the findings from this project are actually helpful in terms of that. These are the things that have been positives in other parts of the UK. These are the things that have worked well. These are the things that can be taken and to move forwards in terms of early years workforce strategy. But I think what is absolutely key is we've got to address the quality of qualifications. People need to be really confident that it doesn't matter who they're employing, when it says they've got that level 3, for example, that they know exactly this person will have covered these topics and know the knowledge and skills that they are bringing with them. And, you know, at the moment that we don't have that in place. I think the commitment to graduate leadership and putting that we're aiming for 50%. If you look at the data at the moment that the Department for Education are holding, it says we're at 48%. So if that's true, how would I be to question data? But if that is the case, then actually it wouldn't take much for us to move to that 50%. And then we could be on the same aspirational journey as Scotland to then be looking to go even higher. I think the other thing is around those consistent titles for those people working in the sector, that you see differences across different nurseries, and it makes it really quite confusing for a young person trying to develop their career to kind of know, where do I actually go? And I think also it's about recognising, you know, the geographical size of England in comparison to some of the other nations, that actually that localised adaptability does need to happen. Thinking about the structures that are in place there already that we can be tapping into, so the stronger practice hubs, for example, the role of our local authorities, but also the role, I thought it was interesting, the Estonia case of bringing together further education and higher education and local authorities so that you've got a much more joined up approach. And we are starting to see this develop. If you look in the updated literature review, you know, Bristol and Yorkshire looking at more place-based initiatives, there is positive movement in this direction, and I think we really need to think about that. So I just want to obviously acknowledge everybody that's been involved in the project. Sarah's sat there at the back as well, and she's just been a fantastic support, and thank you to Beatrice, who's managed to kind of keep us all in check throughout the project as well. People can download the interim report, the full report, or there's a handy executive summary for those that are a bit more time pressed to look at. But I believe now we're going to hand over to Matthias, hopefully, who's going to offer some reflections to give you all a chance to think what those questions are that you want to ask us, and then we'll take those there. So it's an absolute pleasure to have, I hope, it's the technology bit, Professor Matthias Ervin, who's over in Dublin at the moment. to offer some reflections on the project. Welcome, Matthias. Matthias, I've been asked if you can unmute your mic, please.
Oh no. Okay.
There you are. Lovely to see you, Matthias.
Okay, so I hope people can hear me. Well, it is an absolute, I mean, I listened with great interest now to this, to the final presentation of this report. It's a real honor and a pleasure to having been able to work with and alongside this fabulous team, this outstanding team in terms of producing this detailed insight into issues, policies, and as you said at the very beginning, concrete recommendations, what can be done in terms of the early childhood workforce in the four nations of the United Kingdom. So I can't possibly add anything to this report. But in terms of a more general reflection, there's a few thoughts that I think I would like to share with you. And mainly having just come back from the G20 summit in South Africa, where the final leaders' declaration in paragraph 1110 of a long declaration renews a very strong commitment to early childhood care and education as pillars, as key components of the basically the aim of this year's G20 summit to foster solidarity, equality, and sustainability. And I suppose maybe that is something that we could add into our discussion about the ongoing crisis of legitimation and recognition in our field. And as you say, and as I've noticed somebody put it in the chat, we had many similar discussions, reports over the years pointing out issues, so they don't seem to be going away. And my question is, where to from here with this document? How do we use this document in a public open discussion about how to address fundamental questions of recognition of the importance of early childhood education and care and the work with the youngest citizens in our societies? And I suppose one of the things that we are good at, and I think this report is one of the an outstanding example for that, is we are very good at pointing out the issues, at pointing out pathways towards developing and implementing policies, and we are very good at addressing policymakers who are who we think are in the position to actually resource and legislate for this to happen. I think what we're not so good at is, as an overall collective early childhood profession, is to connect our internal debate about professionalizing the early childhood workforce with a wider debate about the role and the importance of the care economy in society, which is much broader than the critically important work with the youngest children, but really to sort of engage proactively in a debate about solidarity, equality, sustainability, as it affects all domains of society, including the economy. And I think we need to be stronger on that. A second observation, I think, and again, this is about where to from here, would be a critical introspection, but also then sort of critical engagement in an outward-facing discussion about the purpose of early childhood education and care. So what are we educating for? We are, and I'm realizing this with some astonishment, actually, we are about to enter the second quarter of the 21st century, not used to sound like science fiction or something, but it's actually just around the corner. So we're in the 21st century. I sometimes have this feeling that a lot of our thinking in terms of how we think about early childhood education and care is still firmly grounded in sort of last century's, 20th century sort of thinking, logics, orientations. So I think we need to actively engage internally and externally in a debate about the purpose of early child education. And I say this as we are realizing that the children that are in our services now and that will be in our services for the foreseeable future are growing up under conditions that people refer to as the poly crisis. And the question of education for resilience, for peace, for survival, I think need to be critically debated in a societal space, and we need to have a much more we need to be much more vocal about that. So I suppose while I appreciate the importance of the work that has been carried out by this project, building on similar work that has been conducted over the years, I think we now need to have a discussion about what to do with this, other than bringing it to the attention of the policymaker with the purse strings, but really sort of bringing this into a democratic public space about sort of what kind of society do we imagine we are? What is the purpose of education as a universal child's right from birth? And what in consequence does that mean for the professionals working in this field? So that's my tuppence on this. But congratulations to the report and to the team.
So yeah, I think ultimately we are, well, I don't think we are talking about the youngest members of our society and actually what do we want services to look like for them. And I think this is hugely important. Thank you very much again for that, Matthias, for that reflection. We are now going to invite my colleagues back to come and sit at the front, please, and to take questions. We've got a mic in the room. Catherine and Sasha are monitoring the online questions as well, so they will read those out to us. And I'm just going to look to Beatrice to make sure we keep to time as well, so she will wave at me when we get to that point. So yeah, colleagues, please come back to the front and we'll see what questions there are. Yes, at the back there.
Hello. Hi. I thought that was really, really interesting. My question is, I guess I'm slightly less philosophical than Matthias, having worked at ministries of education where I had amazing, interesting research briefs across my desk all the time. My question is, what would your thoughts be for how some of these things might be implemented? So like practically, how could, like what's an quick, easy win? I know there's no easy wins, but like if you could wave a magic wand and have something happen, what practically do you think needs to happen for one of these things to happen? Let's start with maybe qualifications. Hopefully that's not a tricky question.
No,
I mean it to be.
not at all. And it's, I think for all of us, we've all been thinking about it for our respective nations. And I think, you know, if you want someone to design the implementation of good, high quality qualifications, I'm available. But I think there is something about drawing on how it's worked in other countries. So I think I was very struck by the Irish model and how they've been looking to ensure the quality of their degrees and looking at the implementation of those degrees, and how that's a really good example of we can draw on that. It's a very similar system in some respects to the one that we've got here in terms of the role of private providers. But it's, you know, I don't think we want to move to a system where we end up with offset inspections of qualifications in early years, but there are ways in which to look at how qualifications are being implemented to make sure they're of a high standard. And even just, you know, to have some baselines of we expect someone to have spent so many hours with a baby, so many hours with a toddler. And at the moment, we can't offer those guarantees. So I think there's some baselines, and then monitoring that those are being put in place. Then you've got the basis of your high quality qualifications. It's in the implementation. And I think, you know, as I said, it's not that what's there on paper, it's bad. It's just we've got to ensure the implementation side of things. And as I say, international colleagues have been doing that, and we can look to them.
It's a really good question. People say that when they're floundering for an answer. It's a really good question. Do you know, my first reaction is we've got to mobilise the early years professionals politically, because people can design, people can create policy, but it's actually this group of people who we rely on. And if they are not feeling strong or not feeling good about themselves, somehow there needs to be a support. So I think one of the things we need to do in Scotland is a roadshow and take this report all over. We were very careful in our invitations for interviews and for focus groups to cover the length and breadth of Scotland. So much happens in Scotland in what we call the central belt. It's like Santa's tummy. And everybody else is everywhere else. So we were in Orkney, we were in the Borders, we were in Fife, we were in the islands. And we have to do that if we're going to have people really think anybody cares about what they're doing tomorrow as they drive a long distance to take their child or to be the worker in an early years provision. So for me, that's absolutely fundamental. It's about politicizing, it's about democracy, it's about pedagogy being a political act. And then from that, I think we have to work with our systems. And we have to, I talked about refocusing, I think we need to refocus our government, who have done a lot, who feel they've done a lot, who would say, but we've just ensured that everybody is entitled to the living wage, not the minimum wage. But then if people can't afford to implement that in their settings, it doesn't matter what the policy looks like. So we have to have those conversations about, okay, how far has our policy got? And to do it in a supportive way, I suppose I just believe it's about having much better communication.
We've got lots of hands up.
Introduce themselves when they're asking
Yeah.
a question.
So yeah, and thank you, Beatrice, for that. So if I don't know who put their hand up first, and so can come. Thank you. And could you just introduce yourself when people are asking you a question? Sorry, I should have asked you.
No problem. Sam Cream from Collective Futures, a philanthropic foundation supporting early childhood development, but also used to work for a nursery provider myself. I guess 2 questions and a reflection. First of all, thank you so much for such a good summary of challenges and opportunities. I think thinking about the qualifications piece, it would be really interesting to understand whether or not you've, as part of this research, or whether it's a next step to actually identify the number of different, especially just starting with level 3s, right? Like if that's the main entry route into the sector and into the profession, do we have an idea of how many different offerings there are, and is there a way of creating, to the question on solutions, is there a way of creating a trust pilot type thing where both the people who have been on the different apprenticeships and courses get to provide feedback on the quality of them, and there's some really simple measures that we could share, and then the providers who then end up getting those level 3s in their settings get to then say, what's the quality of the person coming in terms of their qualification then, just to provide some transparency and I guess an easier way for people trying to make a decision to pick which apprenticeship they should maybe go on in terms of where they'll end up at the beginning. I feel like maybe an easier solution. And then the other thing that listening to this discussion made me think about is the question on language prompted a thought on, I know somebody working for an AI company that's basically all about language and how to actually make it easier for people to understand and also to translate, and whether or not there's an opportunity there, which then also led me to think about whether or not we've thought about the role that new technologies will have in the workforce as well over time. Sorry, there's a bit of.
I don't remember the first question now. I think in terms of the number of qualifications, Sarah and I did a project. It was looking at the level 6, the degrees, that was also funded by Nuffield, and we identified over 500 possibilities. If someone aged 18 wants to pick to do a degree that will provide them with some kind of pathway to working with young children. Once you kind of started to work out where sometimes they were combined offers, I think we got it down to around 300, that technically if you were willing to go anywhere in the country, you've got an offer of 300 degrees, and yet there was no consistency as to the number of hours in placement that they do. Sometimes the age range was birth to 5, sometimes it's birth to 8. I think we had one that was birth to 21. And, you know, it's just an illustrative example of that. Was just looking at the degree level 6 qualifications. I have to say, I think I'd be a little bit scared looking at the level 3 in the English context in terms of how many routes we would find. And even just within those apprenticeships, can I say there was a lot of praise for the apprenticeships? The sector are really liking that model, but there's just so many different patterns of delivery. And I know, you know, on another project I'm working on, that one, you know, started out with 10 modules and then have just cut it down to 4 modules, and you're kind of like, oh, hang on a second, how can that be? So I think there is a piece of work to be done there to look at what's happening around the level 3 qualifications and the level 6s as well, because, you know, someone should be confident that I'm employing this person and I know that they're going to come with the knowledge and skills needed to work with young children. So that's what I would kind of say on that piece, but I'll open up to colleagues who might remember the questions better than I do.
I think in Wales we do have a kind of framework, but on the social care side for qualifications from level 2, 3 to 5, and now graduate degrees. And I think there is, you know, some consistency there about how many hours they should have done in a setting. What we find is there is a duality then. If you're working with a 3 and 4-year-old in a setting, it might be very different to what you need to work with a 3 to 4-year-old in a nursery class in a school. So there's a duality that really affects transferability. So you can't take that qualification from the non-maintained sector, which is very early years focused, but you could teach in a nursery class 3 to 4-year-olds with a PGC and very little early years focus. So there's a duality, I think. So that I think the Social Care Wales list has been seen as a step forward. We had the same, though, a lot of praise for as well apprenticeships because of the time. It's not that you're in once a week in a setting, you're in for a block. So you're getting really used to the whole thing of working in the sector. Whereas if you're there a day in a week, you're not part of the team. So they talked about things like that as well in terms of how you do a course. Do you give them blocks like teacher training, which does give you a feel, or do you have one day a week, which isn't the same feel? So I don't think if that answered at all, but thank you.
And just an anecdote, one of the things we used to do was you had the apprenticeship. Oh, you had the apprenticeship, and then we had like an apprenticeship manager because we had 40 nurseries who then provided additional support in versus like what the apprenticeship provider would do, because we found it wasn't actually enough to get them ready to be a level 3, qualified level 3 in the setting.
Do you want to add?
I hope it's relevant. I think Scotland might, I'm not sure about taking interventions to scale. So I was going to suggest that the BA childhood practice in Scotland has been a very good intervention, and maybe it could be a model for going to scale. The universities have all collaborated. There aren't so many of them, but there are 10 institutions all offering the BA childhood practice. There are people able to go to honours degree level with that, and then on into masters. And there is a group of people who come from each of the universities to talk together and to plan for the parity of what they're offering BA childhood practice. But we're still at a point that most of the people who do those degrees are already in practice. They have further education qualifications, and they're stepping up and skilling themselves further. So they're studying part-time. We only have 2 institutions who are taking truly school leavers and undergraduates coming in. So there isn't the same parity with that. But in terms of teacher education and PGDEs, our big worry, I think, is that there's less and less content on early childhood. And if you don't understand what comes before for the children you're teaching, I think it's very difficult to then understand play pedagogy, which is being advocated in early primary school, and people are stepping up. Again, there's a body that works across universities, but we've lost most of the practice element in early childhood now. And I think that's an extraordinary worry. And it's because partly there isn't a career opportunity anymore for teachers in early childhood. They will be peripatetic, they'll be specialist. There are 700 of them left. And that has dropped from being the largest part of the registered workforce. So the qualifications have to be good wherever they come from, but I would hate to see teacher education drop early childhood altogether. There's a real reason for understanding it.
Maybe just to say in Northern Ireland, because we are so small, we have our early childhood studies degree and also then a PGCE in early years, which then tends to really ensure that our students go out with that real sort of focus on early childhood education. But there is unfortunately a move for some primary teachers to think, I like the idea of working in a nursery classroom, and all of a sudden, because they have QTS and moving in without that notion of play pedagogy, and that really is a concern in Northern Ireland likewise.
Thank you. I think the question at the front here.
Thank you. Juliet Collier, Campaign for Learning. We run the Secretariat for Early Education, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Early Education and Childcare. I'm delighted to have you speak at the next meeting. I suppose both my questions relate to next steps, because I love what you've done in terms of getting really granular, detailed, to the real gross, the nubs of things that you need doing and understanding the situations. We would love to be involved in supporting that having an influence on policy. And so my question is, first of all, what things would be helpful for us to do to engage with you to make sure that we can actually make a difference and influence policy? That's my first thing. And the other thing is, Campaign for Learning is independent part of a much larger charity called NCFE, who happens to deliver the T-level qualifications on. So we would also like to build that rapport and, introduce you to the people who within NCFE, because I think the things that you were talking about are really relevant to the work that they do.
Thank you. And yes, happy for that introduction to take place. I think in terms of next steps, within the expert stakeholders that we spoke to across the nations, we do have the voice of practitioners, but I think one of the key findings that came from the international examples, but also examples in Wales and Scotland as well, is that this has got to be done with the sector and not done to them. So I think for organisations like yourself to be supporting us in, providing that voice of the people that are there doing this work, I think that's where the real support lies. In the same way that, Beatrice representing early education, that's what we need now, is to be bringing that sector voice together. And I think part of that sector voice is, sometimes I feel slightly disheartened that I've been doing research in this area for over 20 years and I feel like I'm still saying the same things. I know. And do you feel the same? That you're just kind of like, we're stuck in a loop.
Circular.
Yeah. And I think we have got some really positive documents coming out from the various departments now. Then it's like, that should be the starting point. You've got the documents, now come and talk to us, and we'll do that collaborative piece around, you know, what do the titles need to look like? How are we going to go around sorting out the paying conditions? So I think it's that collaboration.
Absolutely, because you've got the information, you know what needs doing, you've got your recommendations. How do we get that to make systemic change?
We're at time and we haven't gone to the online questions at all. I wonder whether we should just quickly.
Yeah, so obviously in the room have the advantage of being able to stay and have lunch, so do come and talk to us over lunch. But is there anything online?
So there's a couple of questions in terms of the discontinuation of early childhood degrees and the reduction of support and resources into that, and especially, are you concerned that graduates within the workforce are less likely due to that?
I suspect these will be colleagues that are part of the early childhood studies degree networks. I think it's no secret that higher education is facing quite a tough time at the moment. We are seeing course closures. And I think that is something around the kind of the localized model. If those courses go, again, from the project we did on degrees, we know that invariably people, when they finish their degree, they go back into the local community of that university. So if we end up with pockets of the country where there aren't degrees available, arguably we end up with pockets of the country that don't have a degree workforce available to them. So I think there is something about looking at the distribution of where those degrees are available, also thinking about the role of further education alongside higher education in that delivery. And, you know, potentially having to go to vice chancellors and say, don't close this programme, because if you do that, I mean, okay, from the University of Plymouth, I'll use the University of Plymouth as an example. We've got the defence strategy coming in, which is going to create jobs. Arguably, those people that come and take up those jobs are going to have families. They're going to need people to look after their children. Therefore, part of that strategy has to be looking at the expansion of the workforce in order to make sure that we've got the people to work in those nurseries. And I think there are some interesting examples, as I say, in the updated literature review, where localities are looking at the models that can be developed, so that when we're developing a skills strategy, it's not necessarily thinking about future technologies and all of those kind of things. It's like those people working in those future technologies are going to, at some point, arguably need childcare services. So how do we make sure these strategies are really joined up at those local levels? Any other questions are online? Perhaps if we take one more from online, because we've just gone over time, and then people in the room come and grab us over lunch and have conversations with us.
Yeah, so there's one question for Glenda T. Wales is often presented as a positive example of co-construction in curriculum and policy. Do practitioners in Wales feel that the collaborative approach has any tangible impact on their workload, motivation, or retention?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure with different policies that you would see that on the ground, people saying it has changed some of those key things. I think specifically the curriculum for non-maintained settings, part of the research I've done, the fact that there was ownership was seen as positive, that they believed in it, and they believed in the play aspect, the outdoor aspect, all those things, they believed in it, so it was, for them, was going in the right direction. But the biggest situation of retention, recruitment, and all those things is a much bigger, more complicated thing. So I think the people I've spoken to, they like that document. It goes with their ethos, the values, the things that they think are important. So it's probably easier for them to do that without thinking it is the right thing. But I agree, and with the wider curriculum, obviously there is discussions about implementation as well and how that can be done. But I think on the small scale, people feel what we're doing now in this nursery at least is the right ethos.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming along today, those that are in the room, and thank you those who have joined us online. I'm aware we're slightly over time, so apologies for that. I think as a project team, we're very happy for people to reach out and contact us and to ask questions. If you're like me, you'll think about them once you get on the tube. So do send those questions through to us, but also just to say that we are going to be having nation-specific events in the new year, and we will do some nation-specific kind of working papers to kind of get that detail out to people. So do look out for those via the Early Education website. Lastly, thank you again to Nuffield for hosting, but also for funding the project. Yeah, we enjoyed today, and we will continue these conversations over lunch. So thank you very much, everybody.